Are you interested in psychedelics and the brain and what's happening? Are you someone who's looking to do a psychedelic to change a pattern of behavior, whether that's an addiction or thought patterns about yourself? Do you question where those thought patterns come from? How did you start to believe in your identity and all that you do about you? Or where did your political, religious ideologies come from? What about the way you relate to other human beings or relate in your deep relationships? How about your triggers? Where did they come from? Why and how do they hijack you? Are psychedelics potentially a tool to rewire this? Well, as you know, in the psychedelic renaissance, there's much talk about the fact that psychedelics are the most powerful tools for reset. But what is a reset? And what does it really take to reset one's nervous system or thinking patterns and habits? Today, I invited Dr. Manesh Girn on. He's also known as the psychedelic scientist on YouTube and Instagram, where he takes very complex psychedelic research ideas and makes them digestible to all of us so we can understand what's happening in our brain. He's known for his brain imaging research. He has also been the lead or co-lead on more than 20 scientific research papers having to do with psychedelics. Today, I invited him here to talk about what's happening in our brain with different psychedelics. He's going to talk about his research of what it looks like when someone is having a psychedelic experience in the brain and how the neural networks actually change. What does it look like? And we also talk about what's most interesting to him in the psychedelic space, how he was led here, what his psychedelic experiences taught him, what he's concerned about in the psychedelic space. So if you're someone who's already used a psychedelic and think, I don't know if my patterns have really changed enough, what other tools are there that you could be adding? How important is integration? We also talk about the latest research on microdosing and the many, many ways that science is showing that psychedelics and earth medicines are having profound effects in the body on inflammation and many other areas. So I've interviewed some other scientists that are also looking at psychedelics in the brain, and they're looking at different parts of the brain. Zeus Tapato, his episode is number 88. He was looking at what's happening in the visual cortex of the brain when you're tripping. I also interviewed Dr. Gold Dolan. That's a fascinating conversation about giving MDMA to octopuses. Zeus is working with DMT particularly. And Dr. Gold Dolan's episode is episode number 59 if you're interested in hearing that episode. So my hope for you is that psychedelics and earth medicines are part of your exploration at some point in your life, whether that's for creativity or joy or to explore your consciousness. And today we'll give you a little bit of a peek into what's happening in the brain, what's happening in your body, and how you can use these tools to rewire yourself. If you haven't had time to leave me a review or share my podcast with somebody else who you think would like it, please do that. And also subscribe to my newsletter. I just came out with a new newsletter called Microdose. It comes out weekly, and it is a bit of information about an insight, some wisdom, or some new research that relates typically to the interview that I had this week. So enjoy this episode. Welcome, Dr. Girn. It's nice to see you today. I'm so happy to have you here to talk about the brain and psychedelics and your research.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
So you have been studying what's happening in the brain and neuroplasticity and the effects of psychedelics on the brain. What would you say is the most fascinating research that you've done so far, like some of the data?
Yeah, so I've been involved in looking at a number of brain imaging studies, particularly with psilocybin, but also with LSD and DMT. And I've been collaborating with people, different researchers across the world, across different labs, looking at their data in different ways. And there are a variety of interesting things. I mean, psychedelics really potently affect the brain. That's how they induce the powerful experiences they do. And in particular, when we're looking at our brain imaging studies, we're trying to look at how does the brain change in its activity when you're in the psychedelic experience? And then later, how might that allow us to know who's more likely to get better or more likely to show certain changes? And there are a variety of ways to look at how psychedelics affect the brain during the experience. It's very complex. But one interesting thing that's come out of the data I've been working with is that there are certain parts of the brain that are disproportionately affected. Often when you hear about psychedelics effects in the media, a common theme is it makes the brain more interconnected. And
Right.
there's images that show that, and these are very popular and people love looking at them. But what's interesting, if you go under the hood of that a little bit, it seems to be the case that a certain specific set of regions are what drive that effect. There are a
Okay.
couple of different names for it, and they're going to sound technical. So one of them is transmodal association cortex, and this a part of that is the default mode network. But there's other regions as well in your prefrontal cortex. And what's interesting about this part of the brain is that it's actually the part of the brain that's most developed in humans relative to other primates. So our
Wow.
closest genetic cousins are chimpanzees and bonobos. And if you look at the parts of the brain that are really expanded in humans, it's particularly these areas. And
Wow.
so what I found in the data sets I've looked at is that those regions in particular are becoming interconnected with the rest of the brain more. And this makes everything else communicate more.
So that part of the brain, what is it known to do? Like, what is the function of that part of the brain?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, as I said, these are the ones that separate us from chimpanzees and bonobos, right? Then it makes sense that what they do is they underlie a lot of capacities that are unique to humans or most advanced in humans. So, for example, our ability to think in abstractions and concepts and to create complex language in terms of conceptual thinking and communication. And then also our ability to kind of leave the here and now and go into an imagined past or an imagined future. And also for ability to reason and think in complex ways about the actions and intentions of other people. And in addition to all that, it's very central to our sense of self, our sense of I am this person, I have this history, these traits, this is my likely future, this is who I am. So these kind of models about who we are as well. And so these parts of the brain are critical for these kind of like complex aspects of human thinking and behavior.
So when people say the brain is really the next frontier, even beyond space, why would they say that?
Well, the brain is extraordinarily complex. Our current understanding of it is still quite limited. And it's kind of in a lot of ways a bit of a black box because, well, one, it's inside of our skulls. And so for humans, we can't open up people's brains and slice them up in the way we can do with rodents, for example. A lot of mouse research or rat research is that they have them do things and then they sacrifice them, slice their brains, and then stain them to look at different cells and all that. Obviously, you can't do that in humans. So we have to use brain imaging technology, such as what we do, which is kind of a way of looking inside the brain without opening it up, non-invasively, as we would call it, and inferring what is happening. But that is very limited in what we can actually see by doing that. And every technology has its own pros and cons. Right now, with the advancement of technology, we're getting a better look inside the brain. Just like with the advancement of technology, we get better and better looks into outer space. But in general, it's still very limited. And so there's a lot of untapped knowledge in terms of just how the brain functions, especially in relation to our complex thinking and experiences. And so really, we're really at the early stages if you look at the research.
So, what's the current understanding of how psychedelics affect the brain? I know there's a lot of scientists and I've interviewed a couple of them. One's really looking at the visual cortex and what's happening when you trip. I don't know if you know Zeus Tapado's work.
Hmm.
And also looking at psychedelics as affecting the entire extracellular structure. So when you're looking at psychedelics and our understanding right now of what's happening in the brain, what can you tell us?
Yeah, again, it's a very complex question because, yeah, what Zeus has described in terms of visual cortex was probably his personal theory that he's developed on how that works. And then the extracellular matrix stuff is Gould-Dolan and
Guldolan, yep.
in her work. And there are a whole variety of other non-mutually exclusive ideas of how it affects, right? There's a whole variety of theories that all fit together in different ways and explain different aspects of it, which is just a testament to how complex it all is. So I work with Dr. Robin Carhart-Harris, who's a leader in the field as well. And within the models he's developed is an idea that really foregrounds effects on transmodal cortex, as I mentioned, and the default mode network, because the main receptor that psychedelics target, the serotonin 2A receptor, is located densely in visual cortex, but also in these transmodal association areas. And again, these are areas that are very involved in very complex aspects of our behavior. And so one model coming from Robin's work and his theories and our lab is that psychedelics are able to be so profound and potentially therapeutic and transformative because of their effects on this part of the brain. Because this part of the brain, again, encodes our models of who we are, our stories, our concepts, our frameworks, the things that we as humans use to navigate our lives, right? And by perturbing that, psychedelics allow us to escape our usual frameworks and stories and narratives, and therefore see things from a new perspective, potentially have insight, and then with the help of neuroplasticity, potentially change that in more healthy ways. And one way to construe this all, it's like when we navigate our lives, we navigate through the lens of our beliefs. We have a lot of beliefs and assumptions about how the world is and who we are. And these might be healthy, they might be unhealthy. These might be conscious, they might be unconscious. And the idea is psychedelics shake that up a little bit through its activity on neurons and then open up new perspectives and therefore allow us to change our perspective potentially.
So, can you point to a psychedelic experience that you've had that has radically shifted your perspective of you, time, space?
I could talk about my first experience because that was particularly transformative and interesting. I was around 17 years old, and the experience I had, I was at the beach with some friends. I had, obviously never taken a psychedelic and didn't know what to expect. And I remember just this radical shift of my consciousness where I felt like for the first time I was separate from my thinking self. It's like, here is Manesh, which is just a concept, this concept of a character named Manesh with these beliefs, these thoughts. I was like looking at that from like 1,000 feet up. I was seeing it from a third person perspective and just seeing myself as another basically advanced species of animal on this planet, just thrown into this life, not knowing what's going on. And kind of had this radical different perspective on things and just insight into how much we are unaware of our human predicament and we're just thrown into these lives and just go at it one day at a time, but we have no clue how the hell we got here or where we're going or what's going on or anything like this. And just having that experience opened me up to be more introspective and reflective and philosophically oriented. It made me realize how we live in these tunnel vision realities where we have a particular view of the world and ourselves, and we just go about living in that as if that's the only way to see things. But if you open that up, there's like essentially an infinite variety of ways we can perceive the same experience, the same world, the same life. And that just really made me fascinated in how the brain and mind creates that. And
Pretty
so,
wild, isn't it? Like these filters that it's almost like having VR goggles on from like childhood, from your filtering of your family, your culture. I always say your social, cultural, political lens in which we view the world and the patterns we learned from our early conditioning and how hard those patterns can be to change. And you're just pointing to the first step in that is first to even be aware that you're wearing some glasses that might be a little dirty, might have some beliefs and ideologies that aren't really productive or true or how you want to be living your life. So we hear a lot about psychedelics as being a reset. So that gets into the neuroplasticity in the brain. And how would you say, because I'm not in the research area, but working with psychedelics myself and individuals, after that radical shift and the opening, there's also this process really that takes place beyond the experience itself of repatterning that thinking. What can you tell us about neuroplasticity and what we've learned about it through psychedelics?
So I think everything you said was very accurate in terms of how we can start to think about these things, and dovetails to what I said before about the transmodal cortex, because those patterns, this socio-cultural, political conditioning, all of that is thought to be encoded in those regions that seem to be affected through psychedelics particularly strongly because of the high number of receptors there. And when that happens, it does increase neuroplasticity as well in those regions, which basically means that the neurons, the brain cells in those parts of the brain, are now able to form more new connections with each other. They're literally physically growing more extensions out of themselves to then connect with other neurons. It's kind of crazy to see under a microscope
So
how
wild.
that happens. Yeah, it's at a very, very physical level. They're just growing. And if you think of branches of a tree, there's like this a whole bunch of branches sprouting out.
With certain medicines, is it more or is it all psychedelics? You're seeing that same branching out of growth.
The research so far has been a lot of it with psilocybin, but also with LSD and DMT and 5-MeO-DMT. They all seem to be able to do this
What a
quite
fun
potently and quite
conversation.
rapidly.
What a fun thing to do. Oh my God. Do you just
Yeah.
love your job?
Yeah, it's fascinating. It's yeah, the potential is really big, and we don't really know of much else that can like potently boost neuroplasticity that fast and in a way that actually can last. That's pretty unheard of in
Did
terms of
your
other
first
substances.
psychedelic experience change the trajectory of your life?
Oh yeah, definitely. I
Yeah.
mean, it's part of the main reason why I'm doing what I do, right? Why I became a psychedelic neuroscientist. Just trying to understand all that in more detail and being fascinated by it.
Yeah. So, this branching out and new growth as human beings that are really struggling with maybe some patterns in the brain that run depression or addiction or just limiting beliefs, how does that growth support that?
Yeah, so there's a few different ways I can answer that question. One is that often when people are stuck in, let's say, rumination cycles or in anxiety or these kinds of things, they're often in a hyper aroused, chronically stressed state. And when you're in a chronically stressed state, your brain is literally reduced in its ability to be neuroplastic. So your neuroplasticity is reduced, and also neurons start to function less well. And so they're not forming the connections they usually should. And that usually leads to an impaired ability to regulate your emotions, to focus your attention how you want to focus it, and all these things. So one of the things that psychedelics do is that they help restore the function in these neurons and help them create the connections they need to create in order to better allow us to regulate our emotions and our attention and all these things, and then escape the rumination, escape the ruts we might have been stuck in. They basically grease the wheels a bit and allow you to escape entrenched patterns a bit more. And moreover, by giving you all these potential connections, they might make it easier for you to learn things or unlearn things because you can take on new habits, whether it's a habit in how you think and perceive things or a habit in terms of just acting in the world. By your brain having more resources to create new connections, it might be easier to create those as well.
So, in your research, besides looking at individuals' brains on psychedelics and seeing what's happening, are you following them long term to really assess whether those patterns are actually in day to day life taking hold? Because there's a lot of talk about reset. The psychedelics can reset you. I don't necessarily think it's as simple. So I'm curious about your research. You're looking at the brain, but are you following participants after to see if that actual reset that they're trying to reset, whether, as you said, it's a rut of anxiety or addiction, are you following them after to see if the patterns of behavior are actually changing?
Yeah, so there are several studies looking at, for example, psilocybin, which is a compound in mushrooms, of course, and its effectiveness for depression. And there's several studies that have found after 1 to 3 experiences, 6 months later, a year later, they're no longer depressed. And so you're getting these really long-lasting effects. And other studies have measured things like how are you showing up in your relationships? How much connection do you feel? And how much are you able just to feel you're satisfied with your life? And all these things. And they also increase, not for everybody all the time, but for a lot of people in a long-term way after only a few experiences. And so that
Pretty.
does seem to suggest lasting changes in their brains, which also is found in their minds.
Can you point to anything yourself that you feel like, wow, That really changed me. That changed a pattern or a thought belief.
I went to a 5-MeO DMT retreat actually in Mexico a few years ago.
Tandava?
I have been there and I have done 5 there, but also I've done 5 elsewhere as well in
Okay.
Mexico. I'm good
Yeah.
friends with the crew at Tandava. They're
Yeah.
amazing. So I
Yes,
have
they
gone
are.
there. 5-MeO is a really powerful molecule, and it'll, if you take enough, if you take a full dose, it'll take you full on into a kind of unitive spiritual experience where you forget where you are, who you are, and you just merge, in my experience, merge with just like a pure white light energy and just blast you to another realm, basically. And then for me, it was like the fascinating experience of coming back into my body, coming back into my mind, my ego identity, and seeing my basically operating system start to boot back up. It's like, oh, the thoughts came back. It's like the grounding into this mind body came back. And in that experience, because I've done it a number of times, you realize how heavy and dense a lot of thinking is and how unnecessary it is. And so an insight came out of that was just to trust in the spontaneity of life, right? Of just being completely present, not needing to think things through necessarily, and the right action from this deep well of intelligence inside of yourself just will emerge if you allow it to and trust it. And so a big insight to me was like how superfluous a lot of thinking is, and just to allow yourself to surrender and flow with life in a more easeful way.
Yeah. It's freedom. It's a form of liberation that I think humans have looked for through spiritual traditions, meditation, psychedelics, earth medicines. I had a similar experience coming back from 5-MeO DMT, the unitive white light, and then coming back and my mind coming quickly back online to ask questions, and then just hearing like, no thought is needed. I was listening to a river, and it was like an intimacy with the visual field and sound field that is not quite as accessible with a thought in the way, because thought almost seems to reflect it versus feel it. Yeah.
Totally.
So I'm
Yeah.
really curious because 5-MeO DMT, I think, is such a powerful medicine. What does that look like in the brain compared to psilocybin?
Yeah, really interestingly, it's actually a bit different than the other classic psychedelics. Psilocybin and also LSD and normal DMT, like NN-DMT, all mainly work through the serotonin 2A receptor in the brain. And 5, although it does hit that receptor as well quite strongly, it actually has 300 times more affinity, or it targets 300 times more another receptor called the serotonin 1A receptor. And this receptor is located in different parts of the brain than the 2A. It's located in areas related to memory and stress, such as the hippocampus, and there's more of it in the amygdala, for example, and in other parts of the brain as well. It potently blasts this receptor and has a different set of effects on it, and we don't truly fully know what effects particularly are related to that receptor, but it does suggest it is quite different than the others and might relate to more of that kind of experience of completely separating from the environment, and just like the body relaxation that happens with 5, of just like you can't really, your conscious ability to move your body is kind of gone for a little while,
Right,
right?
right.
And you just feel this kind of blanket over you, and you just go into this experience that you have to surrender to. And it could be something related particularly to that 1A receptor, but research hasn't specifically looked at that yet.
So now I'm curious if that's working on the different receptor. Is there also growth there so that that experience, I don't know your experience with 5-MeO DMT, but it almost seems like that ability to access the non-dual awareness, that space of the full release of 5-MeO DMT becomes very accessible without 5. Is that because there's some growth in those particular neurons in the brain?
Yeah, it's really interesting to think about. I mean, we don't know fully based on the research, so it has to be speculative. One thing here is that the serotonin 1A receptor doesn't necessarily increase neuroplasticity in a clear way, as does the 2A. And this is going to get a bit technical, but one of the interesting things is that whereas serotonin 2A receptor, it activates neurons more. When that receptor is activated, a neuron will activate more. When the 1A receptor, the serotonin 1A receptor is activated more, it makes neurons activate less. And so it reduces their activity. But the thing is, sometimes it'll reduce activity on neurons, which themselves reduce the activity of other neurons. And so even though it's reducing activity, it can lead to increases in activity, if that makes
Interesting.
sense. And so
Yeah.
there's this complex mix of things happening where some neurons are just reduced, but some are disinhibited and activated more. And so there's this complex mix of that going on. And so I think what you're describing in terms of being able to be more attuned to the non-dual state afterwards could potentially be through neuroplasticity from disinhibition that happens in the hippocampus potentially.
Because I've interviewed a lot of non-dualists they've reached the no
Hmm.
self state. And I know scientists have been looking at their brains as well. And a lot of them have used 5-MeO-DMT for the final drop away of the self. So it's interesting to
Fascinating.
see that relationship. And a lot of them really speak about 5-MeO-DMT or LSD for that process. And then that self never really comes back, which is fascinating. So when I talk to some other scientists, each one has a little bit of a different perspective of what's really happening. I mean, we have the science of what's happening in the brain, but you just expressed this experience that is ineffable. Like, even when you say it, like, oh, the white light connected to everything. But when you experience that, it is really something that's very hard to describe. Do you believe that that experience is just happening in the brain? And when people take psilocybin and they see generations that never really were spoke about in their family, but they get to see like a grandparent, do you think it is that when we're tripping, it's just in the brain, that we're not actually seeing something beyond? What are your thoughts on
Hmm.
that?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. I am much more open to something beyond the brain in the sense of the potential for extrasensory perception of some sort, of allowing us to tune in to information that's not strictly related to our biographical life and our accumulation of experience and memories. I do feel like there's a way potentially to tap into information beyond that, whether that's through somehow some other biological mechanism we don't know yet, maybe within our DNA or something electromagnetic of some sort or what have you. People seem to reliably have these experiences of tuning into cultures they've never really been familiar with, or talking to relatives and then later having that confirmed, like, oh, that was your great great whatever. And that's kind of what you're alluding to, and past life experiences and all of that. People have these experiences, and there are cases in which they seem to be independently verified in different ways, and that suggests that it's not just all made up confabulation and imagination.
What is the new
And
science of like the brain, for example, and consciousness? I thought I was reading that there's really some understanding that maybe consciousness doesn't even inhabit the brain, that it's something beyond the brain.
yeah, it's tricky. I mean, this ventures off more into philosophy because these are
Yeah,
things we can't
true.
definitively answer with science. Like, we only know correlations between the brain and experiences. And I'm not sure what it would even look like, particularly to know that it's generated by the brain as opposed to the brain receiving it or tuning into it. Like that's just a philosophical assumption in the end. We know they're connected, but the nature of that relationship is not known. And that's often called the hard problem of consciousness. And there's been varying attempts to try to explain that, but in certain cases, it seems to be this gap where we don't know that jump from a massive electrochemical activity happening
Right.
and our complex experiences. That's like, it's called the explanatory gap. We're not clear on that, and again, it's not sure what an explanation would look like. At some level, it's just what philosophical orientation are you going to choose to take? And it
Right.
could be a hardcore materialist physicalist like Zeus is, or it could be a more, idealistic one like idealism, the philosophical position that consciousness or mind is primary and everything else emerges from that. It's tough to just decide between them because there's not definitive evidence for either, technically.
Right. When you look at the neuroplasticity of the brain for things like depression, are you also looking at what's happening in the brain potentially for like Alzheimer's or other diseases that can be happening? Do you view psychedelics as potentially not only great for reestablishing healthier patterns or changing someone's ideologies or addiction patterns? Are you also looking at this as a potential for diseases that are in the brain.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, the research is in its very early stages, so this kind of work has not been out yet, but there have been a lot of papers arguing for it. And I think psychedelics do a lot more than just affect our minds and our brains, for that matter. Because, for example, psychedelics are potently anti-inflammatory. So they reduce inflammation throughout the brain, but also throughout the body. Interestingly, in rodents, for example, they have ways to, for example, induce asthma through lung inflammation. And they found that if you give them a psychedelic before they do that, they don't develop that lung inflammation. They don't develop asthma. So it's
Wow.
literally blocking inflammation in the lungs in these rodent models. In humans, we can think of all the ways that inflammation contributes to things. It's a core part of Alzheimer's and degenerative disease, our responses to brain injury, even chronic pain. And like basically everything is linked to inflammation, mental health conditions too. And so through those anti-inflammatory effects, which seem to be independent of our psychedelic experiences, they can help our brain, body, nervous system heal in different ways. And in addition to that, psychedelics also have been found to change energy metabolism. They increase mitochondrial biogenesis, which means that in cells throughout the body and the brain, they increase the production of mitochondria, which are the energy centers, this powerhouse of the cell.
Wow.
And so they're increasing the metabolic capacity of cells as well in certain areas and in certain ways.
Wow.
And in addition to that, the neuroplasticity effects and their potential ability also to modulate our gut microbiome. There's been some work arguing on that and some preliminary evidence on that. Like all these combined suggest that, yeah, they can help with brain injuries, which has inflammation and has neuroplastic deficits, Alzheimer's, and then maybe other degenerative diseases as well. There's a study for Parkinson's, although mostly looking at depression in Parkinson's patients, but also potential for something related symptoms as well. I was on a panel with a guy who helped heal his spinal cord injury with psilocybin. That's a
Wow.
whole other thing too, because there's serotonin 2A receptors in the spinal cord. Anyway, so there's like so many cool applications that we've much beyond mental health.
Yeah, I just interviewed a woman. She was on the documentary Unwell. She healed her scleroderma. The Western medicine had given her morphine and just said, get ready to die. And it was kind of a last ditch effort. And she's walking now. She was in a wheelchair. It's just wild. So knowing all of the potentials in large dose, as you mentioned, with your experience with 5-MeO-DMT and your first experience on that beach, what are your thoughts on microdosing?
Yeah, microdosing is a tricky topic. A lot of the research suggests that placebo effects play a major role. Basically, there are two broad types of studies, you could say. One are what we call observational studies or survey studies as well. That's a separate subcategory of that. And this is where like either, people are microdosing in their everyday lives and you just give them questionnaires before, after, during to like, how is your ongoing use of microdosing affecting your life? Or if you're going to a retreat where you're doing microdoses at this retreat, it's like a researcher might come in and give them questionnaires before, during, and after, and maybe give them some tasks to do. That's like real life microdosing. The thing with that, for surveys and those kind of studies, is that they're not measuring placebo. People aren't placeboing themselves in real life usually.
Right.
And so in that sense, we can say, are people getting better? And are they improving? But you can't say, are they improving better than somebody who thought they got a microdose but got a sugar pill? And in those observational and survey studies, there's like over 40 to 50 of these studies showing, yes, it helps people improve their mood, reduce anxiety, reduce depression, maybe helps with focus, makes them more creative. People report a lot of this stuff. But then in the lab studies, which has been about half a dozen, not that many, a lot of the time, the group that got the placebo, that got told, yeah, you might get a microdose, you might not, but half of them got a sugar pill, they also improve in mood, reduce depression, reduce anxiety,
Amazing.
improve creativity, and think they got microdose. And then when they compare the people who did get the microdose to those who didn't, it's a lot of the stuff, they're not that different. And
Wow.
so then that does suggest that a lot, if not all, of the effects that people are reporting are just sugar pill. And they think
Wow.
they're going to get better because it's hyped in the media. They
It's
read all
like the
these things.
placebo effect.
Yeah. And so a lot of the research now is trying to disentangle, like, is there a real effect? What is it exactly? And how can we understand it? Because I do think the research does suggest there is a real effect. Because in certain cases, people expect one thing, but they get another. or they feel like their attention got better or worse, but it actually got the opposite. So there are mismatches between people's expectations and what happens. And there are some studies that found effects better than placebo for microdosing, but not all of them. And there's conflicting evidence. And so it's kind of a mess, microdosing experimental lab research. And a lot of researchers do think like 90% of the time, if not more, it's placebo effects.
Wow. So, what about microdosing, not necessarily for intentional change on something, but microdosing for some of the other effects that you just talked about, the way that it can reduce inflammation or even building new neural networks, even if it's not showing up in day to day life? What are your thoughts on something like that?
Yeah, I think there's definitely a lot of potential there. It hasn't been fully looked at, but for example, in a lot of the studies of the anti-inflammatory effects in rodents, they found that even if you give them really low doses that don't lead them to quote unquote trip, it's still reducing the inflammation. And so I think there's a lot of potential that a lot of the benefits people do report from kind of a sustained like microdosing regimen over time is the anti-inflammatory effect. So I think that is probably like an important thing to look at more. And in addition to that, the research on neuroplasticity and microdosing is not that much, it's not that strong, but there is some evidence suggesting that low doses can boost things like brain-derived neurotrophic factor, which is related to neuroplasticity. So I think there are weaker but sustained neuroplastic and anti-inflammatory effects that probably happen with microdosing, and that can contribute to positive changes over time.
Now, we haven't talked about a drug like ketamine. Does that affect the brain differently? That's working on different receptors, isn't it?
It is working on different receptors, but there is overlap. There are similarities as well. Ketamine is also another drug that's known for its ability to potently and rapidly induce neuroplasticity, and in particular in our prefrontal cortex. And so a lot of the things was saying before about psychedelic plasticity, restoring neurons that are damaged by chronic stress and other conditions and increasing their function and increasing their plasticity. Ketamine seems to do that as well and potentially help restore things like emotional regulation. It's just that for whatever reason, we don't fully understand, ketamine's effects and benefits don't seem to last as long usually. And often people will do multiple infusions in a couple of weeks. But there is potential if you combine it with therapy and in other frameworks that you could extend it. But ketamine
Right.
often lasts less long than psilocybin, for example.
Yeah, and I know in Dr. Gold's research that some of that was related to the length of the journey for some reason. The shorter the journey, the less impact long term.
Yeah, so she's referring to her research on critical periods, which is a particular type of plasticity, not the only type. Yeah, she found that the the length of that neuroplastic window was proportional to how long the actual experience on the drug was. And so for ketamine, it's usually an hour and a half, 2 hours, compared to psilocybin, which is 4 to 6. So ketamine was much shorter than psilocybin on that aspect of neuroplasticity. But that pattern doesn't seem to hold for all types of neuroplasticity because, for example, there was a study with 5-MeO DMT.
That's what I was just thinking. Like,
Yeah, that found that 30 days later, there were neuroplastic changes that persisted from this one, 20-minute experience.
I
So
would
there
say in
is,
my own experience, 5 would be set aside from that. Ketamine, I think, still has its duration, but 5 is particularly, if I look at that, I think that doesn't match, as you're saying, because the duration is so short. But I think it was months after I had my experience that I was waking up at like 3 in the morning, going right back into the experience of 5-MeO DMT, which was beautiful.
yeah, again,
Yeah.
yeah, 5-MeO is this interesting,
Yeah.
unique molecule. It does affect the brain differently, as we talked about.
So, with your science and your interest yourself in psychedelics, if someone came to you and said, like, I want to change these particular habits. I'm noticing I'm just not as productive. I mean, I'm going with the Western mind, right? I'm not
Hmm.
as productive. My thought patterns are really getting in the way. My belief systems are getting in the way. What would you suggest?
Right. I mean, first, I would say I can't give them medical advice or condone the use of illegal substances, but from a harm reduction standpoint, and yeah, just generally, something I really like to emphasize is that psychedelics don't do the work for you, right?
Yeah.
They can open the door, they can give you experiences and insights and, the brain resources to create change, but it's really how are you incorporating it into your everyday life? I think for anybody, with or without psychedelics, it's making concrete, manageable goals that you can measure and track yourself on, and trying to be consistent in them in terms of implementing new behaviors or catching yourself when you're in a thought train that's not serving you, reminding to come back or divert your attention, and just tracking these things and being very clear on what you want to move into, being very clear on what your goals are, what's important to you, and what you're going to prioritize is really important. And in addition, there are a lot of things you can do to support neuroplasticity, such as, for example, zone 2 endurance exercise is really great for that. So jogging or swimming or what have you at about 70% of your max heart rate, doing that for at least half an hour, 3 to 4 times a week, bare minimum. Half an hour, you could do an hour. And that really supports neuroplasticity as well as your overall health. In addition to that, reducing processed foods is a huge one for reducing inflammation, reducing sugars, and also prioritizing anti-inflammatory foods like leafy vegetables and also antioxidants. I mean, there's a lot of lifestyle changes you can make to really support the ability of your brain to change, independent and with psychedelics. And so what I would always tell people is like, your lifestyle matters, your day-to-day matters, your relationships matter. Get all of those in order to support your highest self, and that'll complement whatever happens with your psychedelics and whatever way you want to move. And so there's no substitute for all of that.
No,
Psychedelics aren't a magic pill.
no. I always say they're not a magic pill. And then I'll go to a retreat and I'll serve medicine, and I am shocked at the magic pillness. But
Right.
again, I would say most of my clients stay on for a really long time, like of weekly integration calls, really looking at, if there is a pattern, where it came from. So let's talk a little bit about that, because if you're studying psychedelics and the brain and neuroplasticity, in this field, we know from where you are and where I sit that there's a wiring that seems to happen that then sets the whole nervous system. So, the word trigger became so commonly used, but really, when someone is triggered, it's almost like something from the past is running in the present moment in their neurology, right? And we can see that in a journey, whether it's with psilocybin or not, someone reliving or re-experiencing the sadness or grief or fear from childhood. I'm really curious now, in the years that I've been in this space, how long, and I know it's different for each person, but what does it really take to reset the nervous system?
Yeah, I mean, it's going to be different for everyone, and it's very complex. It also depends what we mean exactly by reset. Because one aspect of what you're describing is essentially fear conditioning. People have a really intense experience, traumatic experience, and that leads them to be very sensitive to certain triggers because they remind them of that past experience. And so they bring all the survival mechanisms of, oh, avoid, be hypervigilant, aware, get away. All that behavior will just be activated very easily because of that fear association, right? It might be a sound, might be a context, might be an action towards you. And so really it's a question of how to unlearn fear conditioning. A lot of the times, and this is like how PTSD is often treated, is through exposure therapy of different forms, of allowing yourself to experience that trigger while also being supported and resourced to be able to sit with it and allow it to come without being, reactive or overwhelmed by it. And this is one of the things that MDMA really helps with, is helping people attain an inner state that's grounded and where you feel safe and held and able to go into these intense experiences and emotions without being overwhelmed, to then overwrite this fear memory and help you feel more grounded and not be as triggered and relate to it in a different way. And that's also what we call processing emotions. It means essentially allowing yourself to have a spaciousness within your experience where it can occur without overwhelming you, and that will discharge the energy or the intensity of it over time. And so really, I think the process of resetting the nervous system is just allowing ourselves to diffuse and get rid of that energy related to these fear associations.
Yeah, that's what I think too. Like, it's to some degree, it's the unmetabolized emotions,
Mm-hmm.
fears. It's the child that went into fight, flight, freeze. And what I see, and I'm not sure if this is part of what you see in your work or whether you'd even know, but it almost seems like a part of that person froze off in that time with that patterning in the brain. And that runs the show. That runs the
Yeah,
life.
Totally. And I'm not sure how much you're into internal family systems, but I think
That's
that's
my
IFS.
favorite.
Yeah, because
I
like
do
it,
IFS with my clients, and I don't know how you do psychedelics without IFS, without like that. To me, they pair so well because the real changes that I've seen have been through psychedelics and IFS.
yeah, like for me, the perfect trifecta is IFS, psychedelics, and somatic therapy. I
Totally.
think those three
That's it.
are the most powerful for helping people change a lot of the time. My experience too.
And I don't think you can really do IFS without somatics therapy
Yeah,
because once that
totally.
child is online, the somatic system has been deregulated. So then it's that repatterning of that system. Those three together, I think, are essential.
Yeah,
And it's not
totally.
fast. It can be, and I don't know if you notice this. And again, this is like very woo woo, and I'm not really woo woo, but I've noticed just in the past 2 years compared to working however many years ago that I don't know, it seems like, and maybe it's because there's so much information out there. So people are hearing this, they're understanding what even internal family systems is. But it seems like people are moving through their stuff faster. Are you noticing that at all?
I mean, a lot of people report that. Yeah, yeah.
It's like what
I
would have maybe taken a couple of years for someone to heal, a major trauma is with the support of psychedelics, obviously, with IFS and with somatic and commitment, like really commitment to rewiring that patterning. Pretty
Yeah, it's
powerful.
fascinating. Yeah, it's easy to get all spiritual about it, and I know a lot of people who do, right? And this, for whatever reason, the collective energy or whatever you want to call it, people are in a place where they're ready to move through things. There's maybe a kind of internalized pressure. It's like, hey, the world is on fire. We need to get our stuff together. And there might be that, like in an unconscious way, making us move through the fear and all of that at a much faster pace because we don't have time to just be sitting on it. We got to move through it to then help our communities and step up in our lives and all of that. So
Yeah,
I think there
you
is
could
an
even
element of
say
that.
that maybe it's the plants themselves, the intelligence of the plants. We think, we're really navigating this planet, but sometimes it feels like, as you just said, you take these psychedelic compounds or an earth medicine, and suddenly there's growth in the brain. What are they hoping that we grow toward?
Right.
Do the psilocybin and iboga and ayahuasca, they seem to be all pointing us to the same teaching. So that's fascinating too.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. I've heard a lot of discussion about that too. Just, yeah, they're here to teach us and guide us. And the idea that the earth is this self-regulating organism, and part of that is having these, fungal companions in plants that tell the wild, crazy apes that are destroying the planet to get back on track, right?
Yeah.
Definitely. Yeah.
So what excites you right now in the psychedelic space?
Several things. I think, obviously there's huge potential in the mental health and physical health domain. But also what I'm really fascinated about is psychedelics for boosting creativity, for enhancing people's meaning and ability to flourish, and kind of like go beyond just being healthy.
Right.
Because even health is a relative term, right? A lot of times in our capitalist world, it's like health means you can go to work and function and
Right.
contribute to the economy. But is that really what health means, right? What is health really? What are the upper echelons of human potential, and how is that possible? And in terms of dropping away attachment to the self and living in greater harmony and joy and love and compassion and cultivating all these things. And I think there's a lot of potential for psychedelics to help with that. There's, exciting research that's been done on people going on a week-long Zen meditation retreat and taking psilocybin on the fifth day and having profound experiences that are still affecting them 4 months after. That was a
Yeah.
study done at University of Zurich. There's huge potential there. And then also, I've been working closely with this organization called the Center for Minds, and they want to, find and develop new ways to use psychedelics and study psychedelics in the context of helping with scientific insight and engineering insight and problem solving in these different domains and helping facilitate new ideas and breakthroughs.
It's
And so I think there is
fascinating.
potential there if we could potentially harness it well. At the least, it's like a lot of interesting avenues of research. And so stuff like that really excites me, and that's what I'm trying to get more and more engaged in.
It is exciting. I mean, and I like how you mentioned that too, because the part I think in our Western world and in our culture it's like, yes, are they healthy enough to be working and be productive and live the Western kind of lifestyle? And as soon as you start talking about psychedelics for joy and play, it's funny. It's like there's a resistance. It's like we're not really talking about psychedelics as much for creativity and play and joy, and that maybe they're really fun. And maybe it's okay to have psychedelic experiences to create like really playful, fun memories. I think that that's an interesting thing about our culture.
Yeah, definitely. I think it comes back to, yeah, just the capitalist mindset and just like the inheritance from the last 400 years of Western history with the Protestant work ethic and just the influence of this kind of framework of good, hard days work and contributing to the economy and doing your role and focusing on work and productivity and progress and being a good member of society and all that, which is all important. But yeah, it's like, we
Where's
also
it
get to
gotten
enjoy
us?
life. Yeah,
Right?
where is it really
I
gotten
mean, look
us?
at the mental
Our,
health crisis. Like, if we
yeah,
keep doing that the same, even if
yeah,
we just add another pill to it, like if we look at psychedelics as another pill to make us healthy, to stay in the system that we're in, I think we end up in the exact same place.
yeah, no, exactly. It needs to shift,
Yeah.
the system and allow people to be more clear in seeing another alternative, right? And feeling into that and not being able to put up with how we've been. It's kind of like having that level of internal growth where the current way of being is just impossible to engage in because you just see so far behind it and it's painful, right? I think more and more people are getting to that.
I do
And
too.
so,
And even realization that your own thoughts are actually what's creating the pain. And then you start to realize, like, wait, where did I even come up with that belief? Who implanted that in my brain?
yeah, and it's interesting. And these thoughts are connected to feelings. And so we go around with a particular feeling in our body and our experience, often, as you're pointing to, without questioning, like, wait, is this real? Where did this come from? How did this infect my mind? And this is where I think psychedelics, but also things like meditation and mindfulness are so important to have the awareness to do that. Because, like, awareness precedes change, right? Awareness precedes any of that. And so you
Definitely.
first need to be able to be aware of it. And so awareness practices and medicines are
I
massive.
agree. Okay, so what we said before, I think psychedelics, somatic therapy or somatics, dance,
Hmm.
whatever, IFS,
Hmm.
meditation and awareness.
Yeah,
Because I
totally.
think if you don't then include that in your life after, it's because, as you know, being a scientist who's looking at the brain, repatterning takes time. So,
Hmm.
as you said, it's like having the awareness to know, oh, I'm in that thinking pattern again.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And
What
this doesn't
worries you
serve me.
about the psychedelic space? Anything? What concerns you?
I mean, I think there's a lot of challenges to face. I mean, we recently there was FDA rejected MDMA for a lot of reasons, which it could have easily gone the other way based on the data that was presented and the information they had. And that's a whole other conversation. But I think a lot of the systems in place, whether it's in healthcare or culturally, are going to need to adapt and change to bring psychedelics in.
Yeah.
And often it's kind of like psychedelics are this star-shaped shape, and everything's a circle, and you're trying to jam it in there. All right. And I think a lot of systems and perspectives around mental health, around human flourishing, around these kinds of things will need a shift to incorporate psychedelics. And so I'm worried about trying to pigeonhole it into an existing biomedical models, which are really limited and don't have much heart most of the time,
No.
and are just construed as give people drugs, make them feel better, but don't actually make them better, don't heal them. And there's a lot of cultural views and fear related to psychedelics and these experiences that can allow us to potentially miss their full potential. In addition to that, of course, there's all the issues around people getting messiah complexes and thinking they're a healer for the world and they're a shaman after they had 3, 5 experiences or 1, 5, experience or whatever, and them causing a lot of harm, which is already happening. And so we need some kind of way to regulate communities and individuals because psychedelics do put you in a very vulnerable and suggestible state. And especially people who are suffering and just want to get better, those are easy people to manipulate, unfortunately. And there are terrible people out there who are doing that. And
Yeah.
so there's a lot of stuff around that too. They're very powerful molecules that need to be respected and worked with very sensitively.
I agree with everything that you're saying, and it's so important. In some ways, we've lost even the elders that knew these medicines in the indigenous cultures. I think sometimes there's also romanticizing of indigenous cultures because some of these abuses also happen in ayahuasca centers that have been running for a long time. But I agree, like our structures need to change for us to move forward in a way that they really benefit us. And it's also important to include those voices, I think, and we're not including them as much, the indigenous voices, and it's complex, isn't it? And
Yeah,
maybe
totally.
even reclassifying them, taking them out of the reclassification of Schedule 1 drugs as a beginning. And maybe the way that we were going to legalize, as you said, that's what I've always felt. We're trying, like the Western industrial pharma complex is superimposing itself on earth medicines and psychedelics, and that's never going to work in a way that's
Yeah.
actually going to be healing for society.
Yeah, we need to mature as a culture, and the institutions, all the archaic institutions that run the US or just the Western world need to start changing and shifting. And I think that will happen with these new generations as well. I'm, millennial, like 30 years old, and like I have a lot of cousins and stuff who are younger in their 20s. The young people these days, or a large proportion of them, are just much more aware from a
Yep,
young age, much more
definitely.
emotionally mature, even though there's a lot of issues with that generation in terms of attention span and TikTok and all that. But I
Right.
think there is a larger proportion of them who are very self-aware, thoughtful people
I
who
agree.
will be quite emotionally mature when they're older. And when they're taking over things, things will radically shift. I think there's a
Yes,
lot of older individuals who are just grew up emotionally closed off, not
totally.
mature, who are running the world, right? And they need
Didn't
to
heal their trauma, projecting it out into
exactly,
the world, and that's what we're all living with. Were you
exactly.
like this before psychedelics? Do you believe that
Uh,
some of this viewpoint that you have is due to your psychedelic use?
I'm sure it contributed.
Yeah,
But I was interested in meditation and mindfulness before
yeah. So was
psychedelics, and
I.
so I naturally that's where I went first as a
Mm,
teenager. And
mm,
so I've been more or less on this path since I was 15, 16. So it's
yeah.
all that I know. So I'm very
Hmm.
lucky to have had that.
Yeah,
But
me
yeah.
too. My big question going in was, can psychedelics actually provide some other experience greater than meditation? I doubt it.
Yeah, it just
Yeah.
depends what we mean by greater, right?
Exactly. And then obviously the experience is very different. So the answer
Hmm.
was yes, like, yes, it can in many ways. Well, thank you so
Yeah.
much for being here today and sharing your message about the brain and what's happening. And even this information on microdosing, I think is so important, that we
Yeah,
don't
thanks
really
so much.
know,
Hmm.
you know? Do you
Yeah, yeah.
microdose?
These days, not too much. I used
Yeah.
to,
Yeah.
for no particular reason. Like I
Hmm.
stopped, but I'm not entirely opposed to it. Just
I'm the
for the,
same.
yeah,
It's kind of your intuition starts to just lead you.
yeah,
And so I don't.
yeah. I
I
don't
don't know
feel
why.
particularly called to it. Yeah, exactly, exactly. If it comes into my life and it seems the right
It's
thing to do, then I'll do it. Yeah,
Yeah. Well, let's stay in touch. I want to follow your research. And if you ever are doing like a research at a particular retreat or looking at brains on a retreat, let me know. Or is there a new medicine that you're excited about? Any other new psychedelics that you feel like we're not studying enough? And yeah, definitely stay in touch. I'd love to follow your science and your research.
yeah, yeah. Definitely, let's definitely stay in touch. And thanks so much for having me.